The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz, and we've got a full house tonight. I am joined by my regular co-host Tony Palmeri because this is a non-campaign show. I'm also joined by Dan Rylance, and our very special guest on this edition is former Wisconsin Attorney General Peg Lautenschlager. We tried to get Peg here when she was running for re-election, and scheduling just didn't permit it, and but she promised to come here now, and true to her word, here she is. So thank you very much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry it's so late. Maybe
well,
it would have made a change in things.
I don't know that it would have made a big difference, but it might have made some difference. I think it would have
changed votes in lacrosse, unfortunately.
I just want to give people a brief rundown of just a few of the things you've done, because your background is really impressive and it's lengthy. And I certainly didn't know some of these things. Probably some of the viewers didn't either. Besides serving as Attorney General from 03 to 07, you were Winnebago County District Attorney from 85 to 88. You served in the State Assembly from 1989 to 93. And while there, you chaired the Assembly Select Committee on Drug Enforcement, Education, and Treatment, and the Subcommittee on Correction Systems Concerns. Those were just two of the committee appointments you had while there. In 93, President Bill Clinton appointed you the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of the state, a position you held until 2001. In 96, you were appointed by Janet Reno to serve on the 15-member Attorney General's Advisory Committee. You're a former member of the State Elections Board, the Governor's Council on Domestic Abuse, and the Democratic National Committee. There's a lot of other accomplishments, but it's only an hour show, so I tried to touch on the highlights. But you know, of everything that you've done in your career, Peg, what are you most proud of? What do you think?
To be quite honest with you, being Attorney General was really spectacular, and I have had the good fortune of a variety of opportunities in public service. As you mentioned, the legislature, being a local prosecutor, which I love going to court and trying cases. I had the opportunity to serve as a U.S. attorney and work with Janet Reno, who is truly one of my heroines in life, and a phenomenal human being. I actually served a brief stint as a court commissioner here in Winnebago County, filling in for who is now Judge Barb Hart-Key.
Oh, okay.
And I've had some opportunities to teach both at the UW Law School and University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, and also at Ripon College. But I'll tell you, the thing I think that was most interesting about being Attorney General, although it had its drawbacks in some ways, and some of which I created, and some of which were there because of who I am and what I believe. But I think what was most interesting about being AG was that you were able to have a complement of kind of criminal justice system and justice system resources available to you. We had a division with lawyers who did a variety of kinds of cases. We had a division of criminal investigation with investigators who dealt with things. We had Office of Crime Victim Services. We had our Division of Law Enforcement Support, which included things like our crime labs, law enforcement training, and the standards and the like. So you had sort of the whole ball of wax involved in one department. And so you could do one thing in one division and complement it with like or similar kinds of projects in another one. So there was a certain continuity to what you were doing. And that was really interesting and challenging, particularly given resource cutbacks that the state's been seeing these days.
Would that be the job then also that you feel you've made the most impact on people's lives?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I'm very proud of our accomplishments in the 4 years I was Attorney General. We collected tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in fact, on behalf of consumers in this state on consumer violations. We prosecuted more environmental cases than ever before in a 4-year history of the state. So we did a lot of those kinds of things. I think we did some meaningful things as well in the crime area. You know, everybody talks about the Attorney General being the state's top cop, which is really a misnomer. We don't prosecute cases for the most part in the way that DAs do. We do all their criminal appeals. We prosecute some cases, as you know.
You were, Peg, the Winnebago County DA, right?
Yeah, I was.
From 1985 to 1988.
Yep.
And who was the most well-known person you hired at that time?
Well, I would like to say Judge Barbhard Key.
But you did.
We'll leave it at that.
You did hire Joe Paulus at the time.
I did hire Joe Paulus at the time.
And at the time, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but at the time you did hire him, you probably never could have suspected that.
No, you know, he was a young, scrappy guy who worked hard, I think, to make his way through law school, and you know, and didn't go to a kind of a fancy law school of any sort. I went to a school in Minnesota, and
Oshkosh boy.
yeah,
too.
and kind of an Oshkosh boy.
Yeah.
Dad, you know, a labor guy who worked in the factory, and he was very, very anxious to become a prosecutor. Maybe that should have been my sign. He was maybe a little too anxious.
Our DA at the time, Bill Lennon up here, who followed Paulus, you know, kept the research going into Paulus, and he had an assistant DA who was claiming that your office as Attorney General was dragging its feet on investigating
Well, you know,
Paulus. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I excluded myself
Right.
from that. It's called recusing yourself, and I did so not because I had an actual conflict in fact, but just because my feelings about Joe were very strong, frankly very negative. And as a result of that, I didn't think it was right for me to get involved, because the last thing a prosecutor should do is become involved in an investigation where you want to get somebody. And frankly, I was of that mindset. I can tell you that the then Deputy Attorney General, Daniel Bach, headed that investigation. They came out with a report. It was actually lauded by the Northwestern, and I think acknowledged by former DA Lennon and others to be good and complete and thorough. You know, there will always be allegations in a case of that sort, but at some point we have to decide, when do we quit, you know, kind of dividing things in half, because you can do that infinitely. And and as a result, at some point you have to draw a line and say, geez, given what we know and given what's there and given that we've, you know, turned these stones, when do we say enough of our resources being spent on this and onward to something else? And I think in this case we got some additional prison time for former District Attorney Paulus. He's obviously spending a fair amount of time in federal prison, a relatively, frankly, lengthy time compared with others. And I think what was most important about the state's issue with the investigation was that the federal government, while it prosecuted Mr. Paulus, didn't in any way make public its findings or what had happened. And I think our ability to utilize the report, which was put out, to explain to the public what we knew and what we knew for certain had happened, and what we had done in terms of continual investigation of other allegations, was important.
All right, Dan,
it was
why don't
good.
you get you in?
I'm not from here. I've been here 10 years.
You'll never be from here, though, if you know anything about the Fox Valley, Dan.
What does Wisconsin progressivism mean to you growing up in this state, and what does it mean to you now? What is the progressive state of Wisconsin in 2007?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I grew up in Fond du Lac County. My folks were from Oshkosh, truly, both born here, and they moved to Fond du Lac in 1948. And I think I was one of the only Democrats in Fond du Lac at the time, and still am one of the few Democrats in Fond du Lac. But for me, you know, we had a very rich tradition. My dad was a history teacher, my mom a math teacher, but you know, kind of growing up knowing about the La Follettes, watching progressives in the 60s, and reading about those in the 50s, reading about those who stood tall to the Joe McCarthys of the world and stuff, I think was very inspirational for me. You know, and tragically we've lost a fair amount of that, I think, in recent years. you know, I've had the good fortune to work with a variety of people who still have the courage to say what they think. But I think not just in Wisconsin, but nationwide, as we see the influence of money in politics. It's
just play devil's
kinda
advocate
tragic.
just for a sec on this. It seems to me Wisconsin legislature has way too much power for a progressive state.
Well, the governor has a lot of power
Well,
for
the
a
state, you
progressive
can't
state.
initiate a law in this state. You can't refer a law in this state. Citizens can't petition to amend the Constitution.
I think in an ideal sense that's true. I think though what we've seen in California is that initiative and referenda has proven to be something where the rich get to be richer because they have the money to control referenda votes. So I don't know that I'd argue that. I do think, however, that if you look at our governor is one of arguably the most powerful in the nation, and we have seen as well going from what was sort of the original progressive movement of sort of kind of down with the power, the rich and the powerful, and kind of the common citizen returning control of government. We don't have that anymore.
You don't have any elected officials hardly constitutionally. You have so few. Instead of having the Secretary of State in charge of elections, you have all of these bureaucratic boards.
Oh, absolutely.
Huh?
But again, that power goes to the governor's office. You've got the line veto and a very broad
powerful
power there. But we've done that in the state. Ironically, it's Texas, which probably has the least powerful governor. And
Lieutenant governor has more power in Texas than the governor.
Oh, absolutely. And it's kind of funny, and a railroad commissioner for that matter.
Right.
Yeah, and it's funny because you think about people who've become president.
Okay,
for
one more
example.
history question and I'm done. Is the city manager form of government today to you an example of progressivism?
It's hard to say. We have had that in Fond du Lac, where I've grown up and lived for a number of years. I lived a stint here, obviously, but again, I think the bigger issue isn't necessarily the form of government anymore as much as it is the kind of play that money has in terms of obtaining that government. I mean, right now we're seeing county boards decrease in size statewide, and I think that's also a tragic sort of result of the ability to consolidate power and afford somebody who's got a lot of money to buy power.
Sure.
Obviously you lost your election bid. That's
Absolutely.
no secret to anybody. but you
I've
lost
still won more than I've lost.
But you didn't just lose, Peg. You lost in the primary, and that's the first time in I think 58 years, from what I saw, that an incumbent AG lost in a primary. How did that feel, other than the obvious disappointing? And if you could point your finger to one thing, what would it be?
Well, it's interesting because let me just say this. Number one is that I've never had a primary before because I've always run in Fond du Lac County, the 6th Congressional District and the like, and just finding a Democrat to put a name on a ballot is a big deal. So the whole notion of running against somebody who at least publicly supports the same sort of values as you do was a very odd thing for me, because in the other elections I've been involved in, I could clearly delineate myself from a political philosophical perspective from my opponents. This race was very different for me because of that, and it wasn't that Kathleen and I were close friends, because we never were, but it was just somebody who at least publicly espoused the same political values as I did running against me. I think made it a little different for me. As to what killed me, I think there were two things that killed me. Number one was my drunk driving violation, which was something that was never let go by the media or others, and perhaps rightly so. The second thing was money, and it was clear that she had the support of many influential Democrats who didn't want me on the ballot, and that giving money to me was not viewed as a good thing politically. And if you look at, there are those who've done it, I haven't spent a lot of time worrying about it, but apparently if you look at the county by county breakdown and see where I had television media and where I was unable to buy it, where she was, it's clear that in those places there was a major change in the electorate based on polling numbers that were done in the last maybe 8 weeks of the campaign.
Peg, I'm sure if you could take back the drunk driving episode, you would.
Well, and
But-
that isn't even an issue that
but-
has
right,
anything to
but-
do with
but
the
our,
election.
But our viewer, I think
but-
our viewers do want to know just what were you thinking that night? That was February of 2004.
What was I thinking?
You're the Attorney General.
Well, you know what?
Attorney General
I'll
of the
tell
state.
you. You know, it was a night. It was a long day. I hadn't
Yeah.
eaten. I had a few drinks, and it was something where, frankly, I was going to spend the night in Madison, and then had an early morning meeting in Green Bay the next day, and thought, wait, I'm going to go home tonight because I just want to sleep at home and not in my apartment in Madison. And I made the wrong choice. It's that simple.
But I was disappointed that the same Democratic Party that went to lengths to defend Bill Clinton for his mistake in the state of Wisconsin, it seems like they were actively recruiting a candidate to run against you under the assumption that you could
Absolutely.
not win the general election.
That is true, and you know, and
And-
I don't have a, you know, that's not something I spend my time worrying about. You know, I mean, I can look at the various elected officials who've been convicted of drunk driving in the past. Judge Shabazz, a federal court judge.
Right.
You know, Bob Caston, a sitting U.S. senator. Jerry Kletchka, not once
Right.
but twice, a Democrat.
Okay.
A number of members of the legislature, a number of judges. That's not for me to judge.
But some
It's
people
not
had
something I worry about anymore.
had argued, and I find it credible, that your real sin was not the drunk driving. It was the fact that the Doyle administration did not like you very much. Doyle's a Democrat, you're a Democrat, that office did not like you. So that the governor could have come out and at the very least had said, Peg made a mistake, it's time to move on. He didn't do that, did he?
Well, let me just say this. That's for voters to decide.
Right.
They've reelected Jim
But
Doyle.
what I'm saying is, what did you do to upset Doyle?
Well, I guess that's the.
You were not popular with the
80,000.
governor.
No, I mean,
Everyone knows
Jim and
that.
I have not had a close relationship, and I think
Did that
that's fair to
start
say,
when you
but,
became attorney? Did that start when you became the Attorney General?
I guess you know, whatever the nature of our relationship now is all part of the past right now, and I'm
Yeah.
moving forward, and that's that.
But what did you do as Attorney General that?
Tony, I'm not answering you.
Well, I mean, but I think, but
Well,
Peg,
you can speculate all
but-
you want, but you know, I don't
but
owe
with all-
anybody that answer.
With all due respect, I think it's things that you should be really, really proud of.
Well,
like
you know
like
what?
for example, you came out against the Job Creation Act,
I did.
which, you know, talk about these misnomers. I mean, you called it, it's like the Water Development Bill is what it should be called, something like that. And you said it contains significant changes in the law that represent substantial weakening of environmental standards that have protected Wisconsin's waterways and air quality for decades.
Absolutely.
So when you
I
came
did.
out and said that, you basically were saying that a governor of your party was promoting a bill that was going to seriously harm our environment. He couldn't have been thrilled to hear you say that.
You'd have to ask him.
But how did you, when the Doyle administration came out with the Jobs Creation Act, now Dan talked about the progressive tradition.
Yeah.
It seems like you picked up on immediately that this Job Creation Act was a complete perversion of Wisconsin's progressive
Let
standards.
me just say this. You know, I am a progressive Democrat. I am proud of where the Democratic Party's been. I'm not always proud of where it's gone. There are Democrats I agree with, there are Democrats I don't agree with. You know, I can say that about my family. I can say
Right.
that about work colleagues or whatever else. That's life. I felt as though, and I still feel as though, when you are elected to a state constitutional office, you owe it to the voters who elect you to say what you think and do so frankly and forthrightly, and I've always done that, no matter what office I've held. There's a lot of times it's been to my detriment from a political sense, but in the end, I always feel as though I feel proud of the job I did. I don't have any regrets. I mean, and people say, like, what would you have done differently to stay elected? You know, would you have backed off on that? Would you have backed off on the Oak Creek power plant? Would you have backed off on one thing or the other? The Cranberry case, the infamous Cranberry case, you know? You know, and no, I wouldn't have, because I believed at the time, and I still believe today, that what I was doing was the appropriate course in terms of following the law and doing enforcement that I ought to have been doing. So from my perspective, I don't have any regrets.
Okay.
So the question you pose is kind of a moot one to me, because it really doesn't matter.
Well, I think it matters.
Well,
for
it
the-
maybe matters to you or it matters to other
Well, I think
voters, but
it-
I think from my perspective, I
well-
said what I believed and I continue to believe that and I move forward.
But what you were saying as Attorney General was corporate power should not be unbridled in Wisconsin.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't think the person who's followed you shares that philosophy.
I would say that's a fair assessment.
And I was just disappointed that the governor did not feel compelled to support an attorney general who stood for a progressive tradition.
Yeah.
I mean, I read just the
Well,
other day.
and to be quite honest with you, Tony, I think you touch on what's a broader national question. Just today I was involved in a phone conversation, a conference call with some people from the American Constitution Society who are asking us to get involved with an issue involving the power of states' attorneys general. And whether it be Elliot Spitzer, who's well known in New York, when his actions as Attorney General, Dick Blumenthal in Connecticut, Bill Lockyer, who was AG in California, or others, you know, there is certainly a concerted effort on the part of groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to diminish the enforcement authority of attorneys general and try to twist what we are doing in terms of enforcing non-criminal regulatory laws by saying that somehow we are trying to become the regulators and create regulation, where indeed it's our role to be enforcers of the law. And what many of us have done. I think I was on the top 10 list for evil attorneys general last year. I wanted a higher mark, but they were rated the eighth. So,
Dan, go
Dan,
ahead.
you back in?
What was your suit against the feds on the No Child Left Behind, and what happened to it?
well, we weren't able to get permission from the governor or the state superintendent of public instructions to move forward on litigation, which is what an attorney general in Wisconsin can't move forward in most types of litigation without that permission. However, we did what was called an attorney general's opinion. I get to opine. I love knowing it's a verb to give my opinion.
Friend of the court brief sort of thing?
No, it's essentially what it is it just is a review of the law. And from our perspective, if you look at the federal law, which guarantees that there will be full funding for the No Child Left Behind provision, so as to allow states to get kids up to the test minimums. That the enforcement by the federal government of taking away monies from states because they don't perform adequately would be unconstitutional, because the legislation itself says there will be full funding. Frankly, Dick Blumenthal, my friend in Connecticut, who's the Attorney General there, since filed suit as well. An individual school district in Michigan filed suit, and Dick co-authored the Friend of the Court brief, the amicus brief. We were able to sign on to that, although I didn't get permission to author that either. But anyway, so we in Connecticut and the individual school district in Michigan were kind of the ones that...
Is the end game of the Bush administration really to go to vouchers by discrediting these
I
schools?
think absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and you see it in terms of some of these virtual schools now and all this other stuff that's happening. You know, we've dealt with those issues as well. The Wisconsin Department of Justice has had to defend State Department of Public Instruction when it certifies virtual schools, and that was kind of an interesting chess game of sorts as well.
Thank you.
One of the things that you also did in your time in office, Peg, was you went after Best Buy for, I think, hundreds of violations of the consumer protection laws, you know, having to do with rebates and Lord knows what else. How difficult is that to go after a big corporate entity like that, or is it not difficult?
Well, yes and no, and Cheryl, it gets to actually what we were discussing earlier, which is that we have attorneys general nationwide. Many of them have discovered the power of doing what we call multi-state litigation, where a number of states look at somebody who's violating individual state laws, and where the federal government hasn't really stepped up to the plate in order to enforce consumer laws federally. Attorneys general have banded together. Best Buy was one where we played a more leading role in it, so it does take resources. We're doing that right now, or the state was doing that at least, regarding a number of pharmaceutical companies on something called average wholesale pricing. There's actually been one criminal case nationwide where a pharmaceutical company was found guilty of federal crimes and charged by a U.S. attorney who was appointed by the Bush administration in terms of manipulating prices. So these are the kinds of actions we do collectively. And they do take resources. And in Wisconsin, the AG's office is relatively resource poor compared with other AG's offices around the country. So it takes a commitment. But again, you know, it goes back to the fact that the whole notion of being the state's top cop is somewhat of a misnomer, because the primary authority to prosecute crimes in Wisconsin lies not with the Attorney General, but with local district attorneys. So other than antitrust litigation, consumer protection, and a few things like that, that primary responsibility lies with the DAs and not with the AG. So our criminal unit was relatively small.
Peg, you were probably more outspoken about
Everything.
But especially about enforcing the open meetings and open records laws
Absolutely.
than any probably any other attorney general in the history of the state.
In fact, I'm honored. I got an award from the broadcasters. For
Yeah,
that.
and Cheryl and I, in fact, you may recall, sent you a
Yes.
complaint about open meetings up here. What is your view on the status of open meetings in Wisconsin? Do local governments, in your judgment, habitually skirt the law, knowing that very few people are going to call them on it?
I think it's a combination of issues. You know, Wisconsin is indeed fortunate in that we have one of the broadest public records and open meetings laws in the nation. And then the question becomes enforcement. And as I think you all know, there are three ways you can enforce violations of these laws. One is individual citizens can go to court, which of course is costly, but nonetheless a possibility. District attorneys can do prosecution. That, of course, sometimes plays into local politics, especially with local units of government, and then the AG's office has that obligation. We did a lot of training as well as prosecuting. Let me just break this into two parts. Number one is, from a philosophical standpoint, my sense is that while a lot of us as individuals may not have the monetary wherewithal to buy government, as certain powers that be can, we should have at least the opportunity to see how government's working.
Yep.
And so to me, the biggest tool in the tool chest, or the biggest weapon in the arsenal, whatever metaphor you want to use, in terms of ensuring that government operates in the interests of its citizens, is for citizens to be able to observe what their government is doing.
Absolutely.
And so because of that, I think the enforcement of that law and the obligations the Attorney General has to enforce that law are huge and crucial, particularly in this day and age. That being said, in terms of the violators and what you do, I think there's a combination of things. I think number one, I think, is that a lot of local units of government experience fairly rapid changeover, so people don't really have a clue as to what the law is, and that's one of the reasons we did all the education seminars that we did. And even well-meaning people oftentimes violate the law because they don't know what the law says or what the law requires. Secondly, I think there are times when indeed units of government try to kind of pull a fast one and kind of, and I don't think necessarily for the wrong reasons necessarily. I think sometimes people think the citizens won't understand why this will be. And as a result of it, they figure they're smarter than everybody else, so they'll do it in the back door. And thirdly, I think, is the very wrong analogy we've had that government should operate more like a business.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, I'm a stockholder and I'm a part owner, and I have a right to be in that meeting, you know, and I'm not sure. Government isn't a business. Government is not about making a profit. Government is not about a single owner or shareholders making money. Government is about doing what is best for the interests of all of the people. people. And, and that doesn't go to next quarter profits, that doesn't go to long-term profitability, that goes to a service kind of component.
Why
And,
doesn't the open meetings law apply to our state legislature? These characters go into closed caucuses where all the good stuff is done, and no one or the bad stuff, no one gets a chance to see it. Why does the law not apply to them?
And a real irony to this, and now that I'm not a litigator in the case, but just the private plaintiff, there's the suit which we brought against Dave Zien, who was then a state senator, regarding the carrying concealed weapons bill and whether or not they published the bill draft in sufficient time, and whether or not they could distribute it to some members of the public, but not all members of the public. That suit's still pending, and it's interesting because the judge in that case ruled that I, as Attorney General, could not bring an action, but I, as a private citizen, could. So I brought the action as Attorney General on behalf of myself, the private citizen, and then they tried to dismiss it, saying I had no formal request of myself to do this, and the judge very wisely said, well, I don't think she needs to write herself a letter in order to bring this action. So I am now a private complainant in the case, a private plaintiff. And it'll be interesting. Right now, the Wisconsin Department of Justice still represents me. I'm presuming that the interests of the Wisconsin Department of Justice are still concurrent with my own. But it's been interesting to watch. But in that case, it's interesting because the legislature is willing to go so far as to say, geez, we still believe that bill drafts are not public, even if we've given them to some members of the public, which is the part I don't get. But what the legislature is saying now is, but what we will do is disclose the bill that's being heard at least 24 hours before the hearing. Well, 24 hours doesn't give a person a lot of time to do regional. Yeah, and anyway, so.
But does the open meetings law explicitly exclude the politicians in Madison from the requirement?
A lot of it does, yes.
Because they
well, it does the legislature, not others, and it's certain provisions of it.
And this gets back to what Dan was saying.
There's certain things that don't, but some of
how would we change that? How would that be changed?
Well, mostly, what's interesting now is what the legislature is considering doing is excluding itself from all of the provisions,
Yeah.
So you'd have electoral change. That's sort of your option. But it's interesting, and it's the same legislature, and I know we discussed before the show the new ethics bill. And it's interesting because there too the legislature is treating itself differently when it's subject to criminal prosecution, and and if you think back historically, as apparently Dan is wont to do, why did folks move here in the first place? Because they didn't want the king to be treated differently than the rest of his subjects, right? And so here we have elected officials saying, but we're going to be subject to different rules and regulations when it comes to criminal violations, certain criminal violations.
See, it just bothers me, though. The only check on the Wisconsin legislature is to elect other legislators.
The governor is a huge check on the legislature.
Yeah, but you can't, if there was a term limit bill on legislators, it would pass.
I don't think those things institutionally matter, and there are things I would argue where the legislature hasn't had the governor and the legislature, for example, instituted what they call tort reform, probably about an equally good name as the Jobs Creation Act, but where they limited what a person could recover if he or she was hurt in a really bad injury. The legislature and the governor agreed to caps on what you could recover regardless of your losses, in terms of certain kinds of suffering, and the state Supreme Court overturned it. So now what's happening, the state Supreme Court is as being targeted as a place where they're spending a lot of money. I have heard that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is considering spending millions of dollars in the upcoming Supreme Court race.
You served in the Assembly.
Yeah.
Right. What happened to the maverick legislators? There are no more mavericks in the Wisconsin government. Is that a fair statement?
They've beaten them in primaries.
Yeah.
Were you a full-time legislator when you were there?
I did a little bit of legal work on the side, not a lot.
No, but were you there full-time? Was it still sort of a half-time legislature?
No, I put in. If you looked at what I did in the district if you coupled what I did in the district and what I did in the at Madison, I certainly put in more than 40 hours a week. I mean, I've always done that.
But Wisconsin was once known as a place where even if people were elected Democrat or Republican, they had a maverick spirit.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What's happened to that?
You know, I would argue again, and I still think it all comes back to money, but in the mid-1990s, early 1990s actually, even the end of the 80s, suddenly there was a real consolidation of power among the Speaker, the Minority Leader, those. I know when I was first elected to the legislature in 1988, Tom Loftus was then the Speaker of the legislature, and I think people throughout the state may remember he was one of the people to challenge Tommy Thompson as governor. And Tom had a theory that the legislature as a whole was only as good as the sum of its parts. And he would take young legislators, find out their interests, and ensure that they sat on committees which aligned with their interests and their areas of expertise, if indeed legislators have that. And so everybody got to play a role in particular issue areas, and committees had power. And you know, things weren't done in the Joint Finance Committee always, but policy things would go to the appropriate committee of jurisdiction. And beginning in about 1990, as leadership changed and those sorts of folks got out, David Prosser, frankly, was the minority leader at that time, now Supreme Court Justice, and he too shared that theory. So Ben Bransell, who used to be Tommy Thompson's head of Agriculture Department, chaired the Ag, or was a senior minority member of the Ag Committee. Bobby Gronimus, who came from a farming district in western Wisconsin, was the chair of the Ag Committee. But you know, people would, I did criminal justice things, having been a DA. People's committee assignments were based on their areas of, you know, the background areas in which they brought some expertise, and committees were given power. Starting in about 1990, 1992, as then Representatives Prosser and Loftus left the Assembly, speakers Wally Kanicki, Scott Jensen, and others started deciding that this kind of spreading out of power and authority was not a good thing, and that everything needed to be centralized because it would afford the opportunity to win more elections, for people to take less difficult votes and the like. And I think that consolidation power, coupled with the money raising that went with it, has really hurt us institutionally in this state.
Okay. I want to go back to the complaint that Tony and I had filed against our city council for a little bit. I think one of the frustrations, and we've kind of alluded to that a little bit, is, you know, the wheels of justice seem to move so slowly.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, this particular complaint took 8 months, I think, for a resolution.
And that's relatively fast.
Is it really? Wow.
Well, we had 2 lawyers working on about 600 cases a year that were referred to them.
That explains why the wheels turn so slowly.
And that doesn't even include the couple lawyers who were dealing with the phone calls coming in from local units of government saying, hey, do we need to post this? If we post it this way, is that adequate?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, that helps us explain or understand, I think, a little bit better why things take so long. But in a case like this, now obviously this project didn't come to fruition because the developer just simply couldn't meet his end of the bargain. Right. But had he done that, and the project had moved forward, and our complaint was still hanging out there, what options would we have had? Would we have had to file our own court action then to get an injunction to stop that project until that issue with your office was resolved?
Well, yes, you could do that. The other option would have been, though, if it hadn't been resolved in our office yet, the city would be kind of moving forward at its own risk, because if indeed there were oftentimes when you get a judgment against a unit of government on a violation of that sort, the remedy is to undo whatever was done in the violative meeting. And so the city could have operated at some risk. I don't know.
Although I don't know if you're aware of it because you don't live in Oshkosh, but our city attorney, he just sort of has this attitude about, I don't know if it was just your office or the AG's office as a whole, but he was very blunt in saying it's just an opinion. Yeah. You know, and he also went on to say, even after the opinion was issued in our favor, that he would have still proceeded to give the city council the same advice that he did.
And that's something the AG's office doesn't have the power or authority to change. And we've taken cases against local units of government, some successfully, a couple not successfully. And how that law evolves will be quite interesting. I think one of the real tragedies to it all now is the development of these sort of private foundations, these kind of quasi-governmental entities where government is yielding its power to the public-private foundation, and how the courts come out in those cases in terms of whether or not they are subject to public records law is and open meetings laws is going to be real interesting. The current Deputy Attorney General, frankly, made his living practicing law doing a lot of that kind of consulting to private units of government and setting up these public-private foundations. So we knew his opinion on this, at least when he was operating private sector. But how that evolves will be, I think, quite interesting, because from my perspective, when a governmental entity knowingly yields its power and authority to a public-private foundation, which includes perhaps members of the governmental unit. And I think at that point in time, there's still a certain public right to know. I mean, let's go into an extreme example. Let's say the city of Oshkosh decides it's no longer going to provide police services. Now, granted, state statute has certain regulations on that, but instead would say, contract with a private corporation and have a couple members of the city council or whatever be on that board. Would the public have a right to know that corporation's business in terms of the police services being provided to the city? I would argue yes. There are others who would argue no.
Of course, in Wisconsin, you have the Fire and Police Commission, so
right, yeah, and so there are other issues there too. You're right. Yeah.
What can we expect from your successor, Mr. Van Hollen? I read recently that he recently removed Wisconsin from a group of states that are challenging the Bush administration over pollution controls on power plants. You heard about this, I'm sure.
Yeah, and actually we're winning that one.
Yeah, and the reason given by Van Hollen for this removal was that, quote, it was not in the best interest of the state. So what is this?
I think it's fundamental to the interests of the state. Let's address that issue first. Wisconsin tragically decided to tie its air and water emission standards to the federal government's air and water emission standards. And what the federal government has done is pretended to it has pretended to be tough on air emissions by actually lowering them very slightly in terms of what's allowed, but allowing the emissions to be traded one for another. And what's going to happen with that trading process, and what is happening with that trading process, is certain parts of the country that are ideal for industry and power development and the like are dealing with all sorts of serious pollution as a result of these trades of the ability to pollute.
Sure.
Okay, so you get 2 units of pollution you get to have, and you get 3 and I get 4, and pretty soon I say to you, well, I'll take those and pay you whatever for your pollution units, and pretty soon I'm polluting at, whatever, 9 units or something in my little area of the world. So it's bad. It's got horrible socioeconomic consequences, because most of these things happen in neighborhoods where they're poor people. Rich people don't like that happening in their neighborhoods. So those kinds of things I think are problematic, but a number of attorneys general sued the Bush administration on this. I think it was particularly important for Wisconsin because we have tied our standards to the federal standards. So now whatever the federal standards are our standards. And so I don't think it was in the best interest of the people of the state to, at least in terms of the air they breathe and the water they drink, to have this done. However, this is something he made clear before the election.
And I also read, now you remember when you ran for re-election, one of the big knocks was that this crime lab was just out of control and was your fault.
Yeah.
And I read just earlier this week in the Journal Sentinel that Mr. Van Hollen has now discovered that it's not going to be as easy to
Yeah, in
get
fact,
that crime lab under
in fact,
control
it's
as it was.
interesting because they released a report which was thorough. I haven't seen it, but a number of people who worked with me at Department of Justice have read it thoroughly and said that it's actually a good report and very complete and very exact in terms of an analysis of the situation. But in it was interesting because they made it clear that there was, quote, no mismanagement of the crime labs, and that indeed we had one of the best crime labs in the state, and that indeed in 2006 the productivity of the labs was at an all-time high in the state, in state's history, and indeed was one of the highest productivity rates of any crime lab in the country. So, you know.
But you didn't get
what
that
you
message
say-
out during your campaign.
Well, what you say, well, we said it. Whether or not anybody wanted to pick up on it or not was another issue.
I want to turn to the future a little bit. This is kind of a corny question, but
Yeah?
you know, what would have been your message to the legislature this week if you'd have been governor? What's really
You
important
know, I
to you?
haven't given it any thought.
Well, think a minute and tell me. Give me a
You
couple
know,
things.
that's sort of an interesting question. I've never really aspired to be governor, so.
No, but the idea being just what is the state of the state for you that are things that need to be highlighted for the
I
future?
mean, I think that they need real ethics reform. I think that trying to get a grip on campaign finance in a meaningful way, which is difficult given the state of federal law on campaign finance reform, is something that's meaningful.
Okay.
I think government ethics reform is something that's needed. I do approve of the consolidation of the Elections and Ethics Board. I think that was a good move. I think beyond that, they could have done things with revolving doors. We have people who, you know, leave the PSC and go and make $1 gazillion representing the same utilities they were regulating the day before. Some of those kinds of things I think need to be changed. There are a lot of ethics issues like that out there that could have been addressed, I think, more substantively. I think, too, that the notion that consolidating the power to investigate ethics violations into a particular person or entity is a wrong one. I think the more people who can investigate, the better, because that way the individual politics of anyone, and I'm sorry, I don't care if you're a former state appellate court judge or you know, or the head of a political party. The reality is everybody has political thoughts and ideas, and so to pretend that there's somebody out there who's free of political ideology without being totally uninformed is kind of naive.
I've given up on campaign finance reform. I don't know of a law that's been written that they don't eventually get around it.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Arizona has had some good changes, and there's one other state, I forget which, but where they've done some meaningful things in terms of that, and I think that would be positive. I don't think we'll ever get there in Wisconsin, which is tragic to think that Arizona can come up with, you know,
They were the only
something.
state to vote against the ban on gay marriages in November.
Yeah.
Yeah. Arizona.
So.
Yeah.
Anyway, all I can tell you
Okay.
is that I think that that's the case. But I think, too, though, what you're saying also gets to my point about why it's important to look at access to government issues. Because if you don't have meaningful campaign finance reform, the need for the public to be able to see what its government's doing becomes even greater. And frankly, the need to have ethics controls on one's government also becomes greater.
Thank you.
Peg, you fought a very public battle with cancer. And what did that teach you? There's a lot of people watching that.
Hold your breath and hope you don't get cancer.
There's a lot of people watching that see you. They really admire the struggle that you had with this and the way you handled it publicly.
I don't know. I mean, you know, a lot of people get cancer, and I think one of the real tragedies is to have to be dealing with it, but somehow try to keep it secret or try not to talk about it.
You didn't try to keep it secret.
No, well, first of all, I'm allergic to polyester, so I couldn't wear a wig in any comfortable way without getting a rash on my head, which I wasn't about to put up with at the time, although I think people thought I was making a political statement or something. I don't know. My daughter thought I looked like a Martian, and looking at the pictures, I think she was right. But you know, cancer is something that hits all sorts of people. 1 out of 7 American women get breast cancer before they die. I mean, how horrid is that? The number, well, they claim this year it went down a little bit, but the number has been going up for decades. People get all sorts of kinds of cancers, many of them much scarier than the breast cancer I experienced. But, you know, if my public handling of it in any way made others who are dealing with it feel more comfortable, and I think it did some at least. I'm honored to have them have felt that way.
So now that you're not Attorney General, are you going back into private practice as an attorney for a while?
Well, that's $1 million question,
Yeah,
and my
what's
mother and my
something-
husband and my kids
Yeah.
want to know too. I can tell you, I'm not bored. I've been keeping busy. I'm doing a little bit of work right now. I'm looking at going into some sort of private law practice, and I'm trying to craft it in a way that best fits what are my strong suits, and
Okay.
also hopefully give me an ability to get involved in some things that matter to
You
me
haven't
from a
you haven't
policy
closed
angle.
the door on possibly running for an office again.
You know, you never say never. I'm
Would
certainly
you
not
ever run
looking
for Attorney
forward to it.
General again?
Who knows? I have no clue.
You ran against Tom Petri in '92 for Congress,
Yes, I
correct?
did,
And
yeah.
you got that was a surprising race to a lot of people because you almost beat him.
Yeah.
What was it? It was like 52-48, something
It
like
was a
that?
little less than that, but it was,
Yeah.
it was
Something like
closer
that.
than
Would you
people
possibly run
expected.
for Congress?
You know, I have learned in life that you never say never. When I went to law school, the last thing I thought I would ever do is get involved in criminal law. I always wanted to be a labor lawyer
Yeah.
or an environmental lawyer. I never thought I'd be a prosecutor, and yet I have spent most of my adult life as a prosecutor. I have loved every minute of it. It's something which I don't regret doing, but if you'd asked me when I was even 23, if that's what I was going to do, I would have told you, you know, no way. That's the last thing I do in life. So, so I've learned throughout life that you don't close the door on anything, that you don't plan ahead too far, because you never know when a doctor may tell you, you know, you have cancer, or whatever else. You know, so I just enjoy it every day that I can, and. You know, I've been involved in a couple of boards now where I haven't been involved before. I've been on a place called Blandine House Board of Directors. It's a halfway house for recovering alcoholics or male. Getting involved in 2 other organizations in Fond du Lac, my hometown, one involving sexual abuse and sexual assault survivors, another one involving AODA issues and young women. And then I've been involved on the legislative and legal committee of the Wisconsin Association of Lakes, which gives me my little environmental fix. And I've always admired that organization for its willingness to do its best on behalf of the environment. So, so I'm doing a few things like that. I've got a few clients I represent. I'm still active in the Democratic Attorney General's Association nationwide, and do a few things.
Sure.
As a former prosecutor, you've obviously put away your share of the bad guys, and you know, in our prison population, our jails, you know, they just continue to swell.
Yeah.
And part of that probably because of truth in sentencing, which is a good thing, I suppose, and yet we're running out of places to put these folks. So with increasing jail populations, prison populations, and a shortage of space and funds,
What do you do?
what do you do?
You know, I don't know that there's any quick fix solution, and I think that's the tragedy and why we probably can't get a solution, because right now we are in a society that needs, you know, the 30-second ad and the 8-word headline that solve the problem. And, you know, whether it's the crime lab or prison space or anything else, I don't think we have that. You know, whether you talk about the fact that we are an increasingly mobile society with fewer neighborhoods and fewer groups in which you feel dependent, so that you have kids who are floating out there who don't feel bad if they commit a crime. Whether or not you talk about increasing economic disparity between the rich and the poor, whether or not you talk about the state of public education and the percentage of resources going toward that and how that impacts kids growing up in crimes, whether or not we talk about, you know, bad things kids see on television these days, as opposed to apparently what we didn't see in our day. You know, there are a number of factors, I think, that in some way may make a difference on crime statistics. You also look at what we have viewed as appropriate consequences for various crimes. And you know, I mean, I chuckle now because at grade school, you know, kids, when I was in grade school, getting a detention was a serious thing. And if somebody got a detention, we talked about it for a week or two. You know, now they give second graders detention for not having their weekly planners signed by their parents who, you know, maybe were gone that day or maybe they forgot it, you know, and they get a 5-minute detention. So, you know, there are a variety of things, I think, societally that have changed, and how they impact on the crime problem is hard to say. But again, I don't think we can just say, like, let's get rid of truth in sentencing. You know, truth in sentencing federally did horrific things in terms of sentences on people dealing drugs. And kids who were 16-year-old mules ended up in prison for 20 years because of a criminal enterprise going on that was far bigger than they were. On the other hand, truth in sentencing finally made white-collar criminals accountable federally. And people who at best got slaps on the hand before suddenly started facing jail time for doing things which economically impacted all sorts of people. So, you know, how we kind of play that out, I think the biggest challenge for us is A, not to be overly simplistic in our analysis, and B, to recognize that it is a huge and complex problem, and we have to look at a lot of things and recognize that it ain't going to get fixed overnight.
Do you think part of the solution might also be some of the more creative type programmings that we're seeing, like drug courts?
Yeah, might as well give them a try. You know, I was always a skeptic of drug court because they have a certain cult-like kind of composition to them. If you go watch one of them, it's sort of everybody in it together, and I've always been a defender of kind of the rights of individuals and the right for everybody to be their own person. But I'll tell you, the success rates are huge, and some of my most progressive, I'd even venture to say liberal friends who are judges are huge believers in drug courts now and are feeling good about it.
Dan, do you have a short?
sorry.
Tony, either one.
Well, everyone's asking this question. Everybody, are you supporting any one candidate for president on the Democrats? So far?
No, and you know, it's interesting. I have 3 kids and 2 step-kids. I'm married to my husband, and they all have different candidates of choice. My daughter announced to Bo Biden, the son of Joe Biden, at a meeting we were at in Phoenix last month, that while she liked his father, that indeed Hillary was her rock star and would always be. And so I don't know, but I get people in every camp in my house, and I'm the only holdout right now.
Peg, with all the negativity and nastiness and pressure in public life, if there's a young person watching, why should they go into public service?
Because there's, I think, nothing more satisfying.
Even with all of the...
Yeah, you know, you have to learn that you just let that roll off of you. And I don't know, I am a big believer in democracy. And I think if you don't do it, you let not just yourself and the people you love down, but you let your society down.
All right, Cheryl?
Dan, any final question?
No, I just enjoyed the talk. I learned
This
a lot
has been fun.
It has been, and you know, and
kind of just, you know, it's kind of like sitting around a table, just talking, having a good time. I
And
thought
to think
it
it's
was
happening in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Does it get any better than that?
One little thing back to the Attorney General's opinion on the violation of the Open Meetings Law in Oshkosh. I think the opinion said that the Common Council members couldn't be charged with anything because they took the advice from the city attorney.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
part of the public records law. If
Yeah,
you
that's
act on
not a very
advice of
good provision of the
counsel,
law,
you
is it? I
have
mean,
a
they're the
defense.
elected officials. They should have been the ones that were slapped.
Yes and no. You know, I think where the provision falls short is whether or not there can't be something that can be done toward the person giving the advice.
Well, yeah, because
Yeah.
it just seems like there's a loophole there
Yeah.
for everybody
there
to
is.
kind of get
Absolutely.
out of.
Absolutely. You know.
And hence, they would probably
Yeah.
do it again if they had the
Yeah.
opportunity. At least that's the advice that.
Well, I think
that
though
they
on
would
the
have been
second
given.
time around, at that point, if you have other lawyers and whomever that says, geez, but for the fact that you took the advice of your lawyer, you know, at this point you're on notice.
Okay.
So that would be my argument there.
Okay.
Can you in 15 seconds tell us what you think your legacy is as Attorney General?
I'm actually very proud that I think I kind of stood in the Wisconsin progressive tradition and put citizens of the state first.
Excellent.
All right. Well, very good. Peg, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. It's a pleasure
We
being with you
really
guys.
appreciate it.
It was a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
nice meeting you.
And
Good luck
Nice
to you.
meeting you.
We'd love to
Yes,
have
it's
you
nice
back
seeing
again
you again,
sometime.
Tony, and nice seeing you, Cheryl.
Same here. And
I've got
like
an
I said,
opinion
we-
on everything.
You bet. We love to
Unlike the
opine.
three of you, right?
We don't have any opinions at all.
I got to do it formally.
Well, we'll
Put 'em
have
in
you back
writing.
again. We'll have you back again, and we'll follow what Peg Lautenschlager does
Okay.
next.
It's an honor to be
Thanks
here.
again. Thanks to both of you. And as always, thanks to all of you at home for letting us in your homes for the last hour. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.